Does your son think he deserves free food? My sister Corinne sneered those words across the massive mahogany dining table, her voice slicing effortlessly through the soft, ambient jazz music of the restaurant's most exclusive private dining room. The heavy crystal chandelier above us cast a warm, golden glow, but the atmosphere at our end of the table was completely frozen. Beside her, her two children, my niece and nephew, were happily tearing into $250 lobster tails. Melted lemon butter dripped from their chins and stained their designer clothes, but Corinne didn't care. They were already eagerly eyeing a gleaming silver dessert cart being rolled past our open doors, pointing at chocolate truffles and edible gold flakes. Across from this display of absolute gluttony sat my 11-year-old son, Hayes. He had a completely empty porcelain plate in front of him. Just a pristine, white, empty circle reflecting the chandelier light. My mother, Blythe, who was sitting to Corinne's right, barely even looked up from her plate of slow-roasted duck. She took a delicate, practiced sip of her expensive red wine, gently patted her lips with a linen napkin, and let out a dismissive, breathy laugh. "Maybe next time, you should pack him a sandwich, Sutton," she said. Her tone was so incredibly light and casual, as if she were offering me a helpful little piece of advice on a rainy afternoon, rather than openly endorsing the public humiliation of her own grandson. I watched Hayes, my brilliant, sweet, hard-working boy. He stared at the empty space where his dinner should have been. I could see his small shoulders tense under his blazer. He swallowed hard. Then, moving very slowly, very carefully, so as not to draw any more of their toxic attention to himself, he reached into his breast pocket. He took out his beautifully embossed National STEM Aviation Award certificate, the very reason this dinner was supposedly happening, and quietly folded it beneath his chair. He hid it away so no one would accidentally spill truffle oil or wine on it. That piece of paper was the entire reason we were sitting in this pretentious room. Just a few hours ago, Hayes had won the top national prize for designing a low-cost, highly effective collision warning sensor for commercial drones. It was a brilliant, hard-won achievement for an 11-year-old boy who had spent his entire summer working in our hot garage. Yet, my family had somehow managed to completely hijack his victory dinner, expertly morphing his moment of celebration into another extravagant, ridiculously expensive ceremony meant only to honor themselves and their bottomless wallets. They wanted to make sure Hayes knew his place in the family hierarchy. More importantly, Corinne wanted to make sure I knew mine. I felt a sudden, violent rush of heat bloom in the center of my chest. It was the kind of white-hot anger that physically hurts, the kind that steals the breath straight from your lungs and makes your ears ring. For 38 years, I had swallowed their insults. I had played the exhausting role of the invisible daughter. I was the designated family scapegoat who was never quite good enough, never quite loud enough, never quite ruthless enough to carry the Vaughn family legacy. I had learned, out of pure survival instinct, to let their toxic remarks slide off my back just to keep the peace. But looking at my son, watching him physically try to make himself smaller in a chair that was supposed to be his throne for the night, something inside me permanently broke. It didn't snap with a loud noise, it just quietly, decisively shattered into dust. I looked at Hayes. I reached out across the pristine white tablecloth and gently placed my hand over his trembling fingers. "Don't worry," I said, keeping my voice incredibly, unnervingly calm. "We are leaving soon." I slowly turned my gaze back to Corinne. She wore a victorious, ugly smirk, casually adjusting the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her left wrist. She saw my blank expression and completely mistook my calmness for my usual surrender. She thought she had won. She thought this was just another Tuesday where she got to crush me under her expensive heel. What my incredibly arrogant sister did not know was that I had spent the previous 4 months secretly, meticulously auditing Vaughn Aero Services, the multi-million-dollar aviation maintenance company she believed she was destined to inherit from our father. She did not know what was waiting for her inside the battered black leather briefcase resting against my ankle. And she certainly had no idea why a team of federal compliance officers had been invited to this exact restaurant, at this exact time, tonight. I was about to burn her entire false reality straight to the ground. But how did we get to this terrible, suffocating moment? To truly understand the sheer magnitude of the family revenge I was about to unleash, you need to understand the dark, twisted history of the Vaughn family. You need to know exactly why taking down my own sister was not just a choice, but a moral obligation. My name is Sutton. I work as an aerospace compliance auditor. I investigate complex financial fraud and safety violations in commercial aviation supply chains. It is a highly stressful, exactingly precise job that requires a mind built entirely on facts, data, and irrefutable evidence. I am exceptionally good at what I do because facts do not lie and data does not play favorites. Numbers do not care about your feelings. Families, however, are a very different story. In the Vaughn family, the truth was whatever my father, Alden, and my sister, Corinne, decided it was on any given day. For as long as I can remember, Corinne was the unquestioned golden child. She was 4 years older than me, significantly louder, intensely demanding, and incredibly skilled at shaping reality to fit her selfish desires. My parents enabled her every single whim. They were not evil masterminds sitting in a dark room plotting my demise, but their endless cowardice and their desperate need to appease Corinne's explosive tantrums created a deeply toxic, unsafe environment. They threw me under the bus time and time again just to avoid dealing with her wrath. Sitting in that luxurious restaurant, watching Corinne flaunt her stolen wealth while my son sat hungry, the memories of 1,000 past humiliations came rushing back into my mind. The smell of the expensive seafood, the rich roasted duck, and the clinking of crystal wine glasses slowly faded away, replaced by the bitter ghosts of my past. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the noise of the room wash over me. The rage inside me was no longer a wild, uncontrollable fire. It was rapidly turning into cold, hard ice. The kind of dense, jagged ice that sinks massive ships in the middle of the night. "Are you hungry, Hayes?" I asked quietly, leaning closer to him. He shook his head no, looking down at his lap. The lie broke my heart into a million pieces. I smiled softly at him, squeezing his hand. "Just wait," I whispered so only he could hear. "Dinner is about to get very interesting. What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you treated your child like a stray dog begging for scraps?" To truly grasp the gravity of the betrayal sitting across from me, sipping vintage wine and laughing at my son's expense, I need to take you back into the Vaughn family museum of pain. This was far from the first time my sister had taken something that rightfully belonged to me. The pattern had been established decades ago, built brick by painful brick with the silent, cowardly permission of my enabling parents. The first major exhibit in this museum of family trauma was my college education. I was 18 years old, full of hope and naive optimism. I had worked late into the night for 4 straight years, pushing myself to the absolute point of physical and mental exhaustion to secure a highly prestigious engineering scholarship to a top-tier university. I was so incredibly proud. I thought, finally, this is it. Finally, my parents would look at me the way they looked at Corinne. I thought they would finally see my value. Instead, the night I received the thick acceptance letter in the mail, my father called me into his home study. The room always smelled intensely of old, expensive paper, leather bindings, and heavy cigars. It was a room where decisions were made and fates were sealed. He did not congratulate me. He didn't even smile. Instead, he sat behind his massive oak desk, folded his hands, and calmly asked me to decline the scholarship and attend the underfunded local community college. Corinne had just dramatically dropped out of her expensive private university. She had decided, on a whim, that she wanted to take a luxury internship in Europe to build her network and find herself. My father looked me dead in the eye and explained that funding Corinne's lavish lifestyle in Paris was a necessary investment in the family business. "Your sister needs the prestige right now, Sutton," he had said, deliberately not meeting my eyes, focusing instead on a paperweight on his desk. "You're smart. You will figure something out. You always do. You don't need a fancy name on a piece of paper to succeed, but Corinne needs the connections." I was completely devastated. The floor felt like it was dropping out from under me. I figured it out, just like he said I would, but I did it entirely on my own, taking out crushing student loans and working brutal double shifts at a greasy diner smelling of stale coffee and fried food. But the real injury, the one that left a permanent, aching scar, happened 10 years later. I was 28 years old. I had managed to secure a junior analyst position at Von Aero Services, our family company. I desperately wanted to prove my worth to my father. I spent 6 agonizing months developing a comprehensive risk analysis report on our supply chain vulnerabilities. It was a massive, highly technical undertaking, detailing exactly how the company was leaking money and how they could save millions of dollars while drastically improving federal safety standards. It was the best work of my life up to that point. I brought the preliminary draft, neatly bound and meticulously researched, to Corinne. She was a mid-level manager at the time. I asked for her feedback before presenting it to our father, hoping to bridge the gap between us. She flipped through it with a look of utter boredom. She told me it was messy, overly complicated, and entirely unusable. She told me to leave it with her so she could fix my amateur mistakes before I embarrassed myself in front of the executives. 2 weeks later, the company held a massive, end-of-year board meeting. I sat in the very back row of the auditorium, holding a notepad. The lights dimmed. Corinne stood confidently at the glowing podium, clicking through a glossy, high-definition presentation. It was my data. It was my words. It was my exact charts, graphs, and predictive models, completely rebranded with her name in massive, bold letters at the top of every single slide. She presented my 6 months of sleepless nights, my late-night calculations, and my innovative strategy as her own visionary genius. The board of directors was absolutely thrilled. My father sat in the front row, beaming with a kind of intense pride he had never, ever directed at me. Within a single month of that presentation, Corinne was promoted to vice president of operations. When I confronted her the next day in her massive new corner office, overlooking the city skyline, she did not even blink. She laughed in my face. She leaned back in her expensive leather chair, took a sip of her sparkling water, and told me I was completely delusional. I gathered my original files, the metadata proving I created the documents months before she presented them, and took them directly to my parents, hoping, praying they would finally defend me. That was when the ultimate gaslighting began. My mother poured herself a cup of tea, patted my hand condescendingly, and sighed a long, suffering sigh. "Oh, Sutton, are you sure you are remembering things correctly?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Corinne is so stressed with her new promotion. Please do not cause unnecessary drama because you are feeling a little insecure about your own career progression. It's not becoming of you to be so jealous." My father was even worse. He looked at the proof in my hands and waved it away like a pesky fly. He told me that in a family business, there is no such thing as individual credit. "We work for the Vaughn name, Sutton," he declared pompously. "Everything you do belongs to the company, and Corinne is the face of this company right now. You need to be a team player." But it was a horrific lie. Corinne got the massive new title, the 6-figure bonus, and the endless glory. I got a permanent reputation for being a bitter, jealous, unstable younger sister who could not handle working as a team. The company gossip mill quickly turned against me. Corinne made sure of it, dropping perfectly timed, fake sympathetic comments to other executives about my fragile mental state and my inability to handle corporate pressure. I was suffocating in that building. I realized then, with absolute clarity, that staying in the family company meant surrendering my sanity and my dignity forever. So I left. I packed up my tiny cubicle into a single cardboard box, walked out the glass front doors of Von Aero Services, and never looked back. I built my own life entirely from scratch. I became an independent compliance auditor. Over the next 10 incredibly hard years, I built a stellar reputation in the aviation industry. I bought my own modest, but beautiful home. I raised Hayes as a single mother, pouring every ounce of love I had into him. I created a peaceful, structured life far away from the toxic, suffocating shadow of my sister. I truly thought I was free. I thought the past was firmly locked away in a dark box. But 4 months ago, a heavy, unmarked manila envelope arrived at my independent office. There was no return address. Inside were thick stacks of photocopied invoices from Von Aero Services. The numbers on those pages made my blood run ice cold. There were glaring, impossible discrepancies in the procurement of critical aircraft maintenance parts. Millions of dollars were bleeding out of the company, funneled into vendors that did not seem to physically exist. A week later, the primary insurance carrier for our family company quietly contacted my firm. They were highly suspicious of the soaring costs and wanted an independent, aggressive, no-holds-barred audit. Because I operated under my married name and kept my professional life strictly, aggressively separate from the Vaughn family, the insurance executives had absolutely no idea they were hiring Alden Vaughn's estranged daughter. I took the job immediately. I spent 4 grueling months digging through the digital archives late into the night, tracing the corporate rot from the bottom of the company all the way to the top. I found out exactly what Corinne had been doing with the unearned power she stole from me all those years ago. Now, back in the present moment, sitting across from her at the dinner table, I looked at her perfectly manicured hands. She was holding a silver oyster fork, giggling loudly at a joke my mother made. She had absolutely no idea that I had mapped every single one of her dirty, illegal secrets. She thought this dinner was just another fun opportunity to assert her dominance over the family failure. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, hard weight of the briefcase against my leg. My past was finally catching up with her present, and it was going to be a devastating collision. How could someone steal your life's work and then look you in the eye and smile? To fully understand the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the missing dinner plate in front of my son, you have to look closely at what happened earlier that afternoon. The real reason we were all gathered in the city, wearing uncomfortable formal clothes, was for the National STEM Aviation Award ceremony, held in the grand, echoing auditorium of the State Aerospace Museum. Hayes had spent the last 8 months turning our tiny garage into a chaotic, beautiful laboratory of exposed wires, circuit boards, proximity sensors, and recycled plastic casings. While other kids his age were playing video games or going to summer camp, my son was obsessively testing low-frequency radar equipment. He wanted to build an affordable, lightweight collision warning system for commercial drones, hoping to prevent the kind of accidents that regularly damaged local power lines and disrupted emergency services. He failed dozens of times. He cried in frustration when his code wouldn't compile. He burned his fingers on the soldering iron. But he never, ever quit. When the judges called his name over the loudspeaker as the first-place national winner, my heart swelled with so much overwhelming pride I thought my ribs might crack. He walked across the massive stage, a tiny 11-year-old boy swimming in his slightly oversized dress suit, clutching the heavy glass trophy and his gold-embossed certificate. The auditorium erupted in genuine applause from hundreds of engineers, teachers, and parents. But Corinne was not clapping. I was sitting exactly 2 rows behind her, and I saw the exact, horrifying moment her face contorted into an ugly, tight mask of pure, venomous jealousy. Corinne's 2 children had also been entered into the exact same competition. Corinne, being who she is, had spent thousands of dollars hiring a professional engineering tutor to practically build a flashy, motorized drone model for them. It looked amazing on the surface, covered in sleek carbon fiber and LED lights. But when the panel of expert judges asked her kids how the internal circuits actually worked, they froze and could not answer a single basic question. They received a standard, generic participation ribbon. Corinne simply could not handle it. Her entire identity, her entire fragile existence, was built on the delusion of being naturally superior to everyone else, especially me. To watch my son, the quiet child of the family outcast, completely defeat her expensive, heavily curated children on a national stage was a direct, unforgivable threat to her ego. She spent the rest of the afternoon making loud, passive-aggressive comments in the lobby, telling any parent who would listen that the judges clearly favored underfunded, pity projects to meet diversity quotas. By the time we arrived at the restaurant for the celebratory dinner, she was practically vibrating with toxic, manic energy. She had aggressively insisted on taking over the dinner reservations weeks ago, claiming she wanted to treat the whole family using her corporate expense account to celebrate the kids. I should have known immediately it was a trap. The private dining room at the restaurant was incredibly lavish, dripping with old money aesthetic. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over the dark mahogany walls lined with expensive art. The massive table was set with heavy antique silver cutlery and delicate, translucent porcelain plates. Corinne had strategically positioned herself at the very head of the table, holding court like a deranged queen. She loudly ordered multiple bottles of wine that cost more than my first car, making a show of inspecting the labels. She practically shouted her demands to the waitstaff, making sure everyone in the vicinity knew she was the wealthy executive paying the bill. I chose to sit near the far end of the table, keeping Hayes close to me, acting as a physical shield between him and the rest of the room. I had brought my heavy black briefcase straight from the office, placing it carefully by my feet, hiding it under the long tablecloth. Inside that briefcase was the preliminary audit report. 280 pages of undeniable, catastrophic evidence. I had originally planned a very different, much quieter evening. I had genuinely intended to pull my father aside after dessert was served, take him into the hallway, privately hand him the executive summary of the report, and give him the chance to force Corinne into a quiet, immediate resignation. I wanted to protect the hundreds of innocent, hard-working employees at the company from a massive, company-ending public scandal. Despite everything they had done to me, I was trying to be the bigger person. I was trying to show mercy. But mercy requires a willing recipient. And my sister was currently busy proving to the world that she had absolutely no soul. As the first course arrived, plates of rich, aromatic food were set down in front of everyone. Steaming bowls of lobster bisque, perfectly seared scallops, imported caviar resting on ice. Except for Hayes. He sat patiently, his small hands folded politely in his lap, waiting for his turn. He watched the waiters move around the table, placing plate after plate. But the waiter walked away, leaving the space in front of him completely bare. That was when the true, calculated humiliation began. That was when Corinne looked down the length of the table, locked eyes with my brilliant, hard-working son, and sneered, "Does your son think he deserves free food?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and dripping with malice. My son looked down at his lap, trying to disappear into the upholstery of the dining chair. Corinne smirked. She thought this was her grand, triumphant victory. She thought she had successfully put the outcasts back in their place. But all she had really done was sign her own professional death warrant. The briefcase resting against my ankle felt heavier now. The 280 pages inside were no longer just a corporate financial audit. They were a loaded weapon. And as I stared at her smug, smiling face, I realized I was finally ready to pull the trigger. What happens when you push a quiet person past their absolute breaking point? The silence at the table was suffocating, thick as mud. The only sounds were the soft clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates and the low, agonizingly cheerful jazz music playing from the hidden ceiling speakers. I watched Hayes pull his arms inward, crossing them tightly over his chest in a defensive posture, trying to make himself take up as little space as possible. The smell of the roasted meats, the rich truffle butter, and the sharp tang of expensive wine suddenly made me feel violently sick to my stomach. I raised my right hand and signaled for Jet, the sharply dressed restaurant manager, who was hovering nervously near the grand mahogany doorway. He hurried over immediately, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional concern. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, refusing to let them hear my voice shake. "There seems to be a mistake with the service. My son has not received his meal." Corinne let out a sharp, theatrical sigh, tossing her napkin onto the table. "There is no mistake, Sutton," she said loudly, ensuring the nearby tables out in the main dining room could hear her shrill voice. "He is not in the VIP package. I am certainly not paying for uninvited guests on my corporate tab. We are a business, not a charity for your financial shortcomings." I stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I reached into my purse, pulled out my smartphone, and quickly opened my email app. I tapped the screen and held it up for Jet the manager to clearly see. "I have a confirmation email right here," I said calmly, my eyes locked on the manager. "I confirmed 2 seats and personally pre-ordered and prepaid for the steak medallion for my son exactly 3 weeks ago, directly with your events coordinator." Jet looked at the brightly lit screen, reading the confirmation number. Then he looked nervously toward the head of the table. He swallowed hard. His stiff white collar suddenly seemed entirely too tight for his neck. He cleared his throat, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he stammered, looking down at me with genuine, pained apology in his eyes. "The original order was indeed placed and paid for. But we received a phone call early this morning." He hesitated, shifting his weight, glancing terrified at Corinne, who was now glaring at him with cold, terrifying fury, silently daring him to speak. "Go on," I prompted him softly. "Tell me about the phone call." "Miss Vaughn called us directly," Jet continued, his voice dropping to a near, frantic whisper, terrified for his job. "She explicitly instructed our kitchen to cancel the child's meal and redirect that portion of the budget toward a second bottle of the vintage Bordeaux for her end of the table." The words landed like heavy, crushing stones in the quiet room. I slowly turned my head and looked at my father, Alden, the great CEO, the patriarch. He was staring intensely at the condensation on his crystal water glass, actively avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. The muscles in his jaw twitched rapidly, but he said absolutely nothing. He didn't defend his grandson. He didn't scold his daughter. His silence was deafening. It was the exact same heavy, cowardly silence he had used to bury me alive for 38 years. I looked at my mother, Blythe. She frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the awkwardness of the situation, but her fierce, blind loyalty to her golden child was an unbreakable, toxic reflex. "Oh, Sutton, please do not make a scene in a nice place like this," she whispered fiercely, leaning across the table, her voice laced with intense annoyance. "It is just food. Why do you always have to act like a victim and ruin Corinne's nice evenings? She is under so much pressure at the company right now. You know how hard she works. You should have just brought some crackers or snacks for him in your purse if you knew he was going to be difficult. Just food." The woman sitting at the head of the table had literally, maliciously taken the food out of an 11-year-old boy's mouth just so she could buy herself more expensive alcohol to show off, and my own mother was angrily blaming me for not packing crackers. "Mom," Hayes whispered, tugging gently on my blazer sleeve. His voice was trembling so badly it shattered the last piece of my heart. "I am really not hungry anyway. Can I just go stand out in the hallway? I don't want to make everyone mad. I'll just wait by the coat check." That was it. That was the exact, microscopic fraction of a second where the last remaining, frayed thread of my family loyalty snapped. It did not break with a loud, dramatic noise. It just quietly dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind a cold, empty void. I looked at my son. A boy who had done nothing but work incredibly hard. A boy who had succeeded against the odds, asking to go hide in a dark hallway so the cruel adults who abused him could enjoy their stolen caviar in peace. "No, baby," I told him, my voice carrying a strange, metallic calm that frightened even me. "You are not going anywhere. You are staying right here, in the best seat in the entire house." I slowly turned my eyes back down the length of the table to Corinne. She was smirking, taking a slow, exaggerated sip of her stolen wine, her eyes dancing with wicked delight. She was waiting for me to cry. She was waiting for me to grab my son's hand, burst into pathetic tears, and run out of the restaurant, just like I had run out of the family company 10 years ago in defeat. She thought history was repeating itself. She thought I was still the weak little sister. "Noted," I said to her. Just one single, flat word. "Noted." I reached down under the table and firmly rested my hand on the cold leather handle of the black briefcase. The naive, merciful plan to handle this privately was officially dead and buried. There would be no quiet, dignified resignation. There would be no protected family dignity. If Corinne wanted to treat my son like a starving beggar at a royal feast, I was going to show her exactly what happened when the beggar actually held the deed to the entire castle. The fury I felt was no longer hot or chaotic. It was surgical, precise, and completely lethal. I was about to dissect her entire life, her entire fake identity, right in front of the people she valued most in the world. I looked up at the manager, who was still shifting uncomfortably next to our table, waiting to be dismissed. "Jet," I said, giving him a polite, chilling smile. "Please do not clear my son's empty place setting. Leave the plate exactly as it is. We are going to need the space on the table for some new arrivals." What is the breaking point that turns a victim into an executioner? While we all sat in that suffocating, hostile silence waiting for the lavish main courses to be cleared away by the nervous waitstaff, my mind began racing methodically through the contents of the 280-page forensic report resting heavily against my feet. I needed to center myself entirely in the data. The facts were the only weapons I needed, and they were sharper than any knife on this table. What my arrogant family did not know was that the last 4 months of my audit had uncovered a massive, sprawling, horrifying web of lies. Corinne was not just an incompetent vice president riding on the coattails of nepotism. She was actively, systematically destroying the structural and financial foundation of Von Aero Services from the inside out. Over the past 18 months, my deep-dive investigation into the corporate ledgers had flagged a series of highly suspicious, massive invoices. The company had paid out over $1.2 million to 3 new, completely unvetted subcontractors for the procurement of critical aircraft maintenance parts. These were the parts used to fix commercial jets. When I dug into the state and federal corporate registries, searching for these vendors, I found a terrifying reality. All 3 subcontractors shared the exact same registered business address. I even drove out to see it myself. It was a tiny, abandoned, boarded-up storefront sitting right next to a dilapidated laundromat in a different state. They had no physical employees. They had no manufacturing facilities. They had no shipping records. They were ghost companies, existing entirely on paper. But it got worse. I meticulously followed the digital money trail through multiple shell corporations. The massive payments were being routed through offshore accounts in the Caymans and eventually landing directly in an opaque, private family trust. A trust that, according to property records, had recently purchased a massive, multi-million-dollar luxury ski chalet in Aspen. A chalet that Corinne had been obnoxiously bragging about on her social media pages all winter, posting photos of herself drinking champagne in a hot tub, claiming she bought it with her brilliant, self-taught stock investments. She hadn't invested a dime. She had literally stolen $1.2 million from our family business, from my father's legacy, to fund her extravagant, fake lifestyle. But the financial theft was not even the worst part. The worst part was the federal crime that came with it. To hide the fact that she was purchasing cheap, uncertified, potentially counterfeit airplane parts from these illegal ghost companies and installing them on commercial jets, Corinne needed someone to sign off on the strict Federal Aviation Administration safety compliance documents. Because she was just a business major with a superiority complex and had absolutely no engineering or safety certifications, she could not legally sign the documents herself without raising massive red flags. So, she did what she always did when she needed something. She stole from me. During my exhaustive digital forensic sweep of the company's secure servers, I found something that made my stomach physically turn. Corinne had dug into the deep archives and found my old digital signature file. The exact file I had used 10 years ago when I worked there as a junior compliance analyst. She had illegally copied it, expertly altered the date stamps using administrative privileges she demanded from IT, and pasted my professional signature onto dozens of safety verification forms for the fake, uncertified parts. She was putting my name, my hard-earned professional license, and my actual freedom on the line to cover her tracks. If one of those planes had a mechanical failure mid-air due to her cheap, counterfeit parts, the federal investigators would come knocking directly on my door. I would be the one facing decades in federal prison, not her. She was entirely willing to let me go to a federal penitentiary and leave my son without a mother, just so she could drink vintage Bordeaux and ski in Aspen. and she thought she could sit across from me tonight, dripping in stolen diamonds, and sneer about free food? The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her malice was almost impressive in its darkness. She truly, deeply believed she was untouchable. She believed that because our father always aggressively protected her, the actual laws of the real world simply did not apply to her. She thought she could manipulate the Federal Aviation supply chain the exact same way she manipulated the dinner reservations. I shifted my gaze and looked at my younger brother, Declan, who was sitting near the far end of the table, nursing a scotch. He was 33, a hard-working field supervisor for the company. He looked utterly miserable. 3 years ago, Declan had been next in line to lead a massive, highly lucrative new maintenance contract. Suddenly, a highly damaging anonymous tip was sent to the board of directors claiming Declan was aggressively drinking on the job. The contract was instantly taken away from him, his reputation was smeared, and the project was quietly given directly to Corinne's department. Declan had never recovered his confidence, shrinking into the background of the family. My audit had easily traced the IP address of that anonymous email. It came directly from Corinne's private office computer. She had ruthlessly destroyed her own brother's career, breaking his spirit, just to get a slightly larger quarterly bonus for her division. She was a parasite. A perfectly dressed, smiling parasite feeding off everyone at this table. And they were all too blind or too cowardly to stop her. I took a slow sip of my ice water. The shockingly cold liquid grounded me, bringing me back to the present moment. The agonizing wait was almost over. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. Right on schedule. I looked at Corinne one last time before the storm broke. She was laughing loudly, head thrown back, at something my father said, her diamond necklace sparkling brilliantly under the heavy chandelier. Enjoy the wine, sister, I thought to myself, watching her take another greedy gulp. It is the absolute last expensive thing you will ever drink on this company's dime. I placed my linen napkin neatly on the table. The time for suffering in silence was over. Are you ready to see a kingdom fall? The waiter returned to our table, carrying a silver tray loaded with leather-bound dessert menus. Corinne waved him away immediately with a rude, dismissive flick of her wrist, loudly demanding that the entire 3-tiered silver dessert cart be brought directly over to her children so they could pick whatever they wanted. I watched my son Hayes trace the intricate floral pattern of the white tablecloth with his index finger, still trying desperately to make himself invisible to the room. I took a deep breath. It was time. I stood up. I picked up my heavy antique silver spoon and tapped it sharply, deliberately against the side of my crystal water glass. Clink. 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 The high, clear ringing sound cut through the room instantly, sharper than a knife. Conversations stopped dead in their tracks. The soft, ambient jazz music seemed to fade away into the background. Every single head at the massive table turned toward me. My father frowned deeply, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in intense annoyance. "What exactly are you doing, Sutton?" he demanded, using his deep, booming, stern CEO voice that usually made everyone cower. "Sit down right now. You are making a scene." Corinne rolled her eyes dramatically, slumping back in her chair. "Oh, please," she groaned loudly. Is she going to give a pathetic speech about how unfair life is again? We are trying to enjoy a nice, expensive evening here. Save the drama for your therapist, Sutton. I completely ignored them both. I looked straight down the table at Corinne and offered her a cold, completely empty smile. "I am just fixing the guest list," I said. Before anyone could ask what on earth I meant by that, the heavy mahogany double doors of the private dining room swung open with a loud thud. The waiter practically jumped out of the way, flattening himself against the wallpaper. 3 men and 1 woman walked into the room. They were not dressed for a celebration. They wore dark, severe, impeccably tailored business suits. Their faces were grim, hardened, and entirely unamused. The woman leading the imposing group was Greer. She was a fierce, legendary, highly respected independent compliance lawyer who frequently consulted directly for the Federal Aviation Administration. She took absolutely no prisoners. Behind her stood 3 senior members of the Von Aero Services Board of Directors, Charles, Richard, and David, men who had known and worked with my father for over 20 years. They did not look friendly. They looked like men preparing for a funeral. The temperature in the lavish room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single, terrifying second. My father stood up so incredibly fast his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly and aggressively against the hardwood floor. "Charles? Richard?" He stammered, his voice losing all of its usual booming authority, looking at the board members in total, bewildered confusion. "What is going on here? Why are you all here? This is a private family dinner." Greer stepped forward, holding a locked, metal document case of her own. Her sharp eyes swept the lavish table, landing briefly on the empty porcelain plate sitting in front of my son, before locking onto Corinne like a heat-seeking missile. "It stopped being a private family dinner the exact moment you charged it to a fraudulent corporate expense account," Ms. Vaughn, Greer said. Her voice was like cracking ice on a frozen lake. Corinne's face instantly drained of all color. The arrogant, untouchable smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of sudden, naked, breathless panic. She looked at me, then frantically at the grim board members, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish pulled out of water. I reached down and lifted my heavy black leather briefcase from the floor, placing it directly onto the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy, solid thud it made against the wood sounded exactly like a judge's gavel falling in a silent courtroom. I reached over and snapped the brass locks open. I looked at the audience watching this video. Have you ever seen the exact, precise moment a toxic, arrogant bully realizes they have finally stepped into a trap they cannot manipulate their way out of? It is not loud. It is terrifyingly quiet. If you have ever had to deal with a golden child who destroyed your peace, hit the like button and leave a comment below. Because what I pulled out of that briefcase next was going to shatter the Vaughn family illusion forever. I took out a thick stack of papers and dropped the very first document right in the middle of the table. It was the restaurant invoice. "Let us start with the appetizer." I stood at the end of the long mahogany table, the thick stack of financial documents resting heavily in my hands. The entire room was frozen, trapped in a suffocating silence. Even the waiters had backed away into the shadows, sensing the immense storm that was about to break. I looked at the board members standing near the door, their faces set in stone, and then I looked at my sister Corinne. She was still gripping her crystal wine glass, her knuckles turning white, her eyes darting frantically between me and the grim faces of the men who controlled her career. "Before we discuss a single number on this page," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room, "we are going to do one thing. I want every single person in this room to put their hands together and applaud my son, Hayes, for winning the National STEM Aviation Award today." My father, Alden, slammed his heavy hand flat against the table, making the silverware rattle. "Enough of this nonsense, Sutton," he barked, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "I will not have my family dinner turned into a circus. Put those papers away and tell these board members to leave right now." Greer, the fierce federal compliance lawyer standing near the doorway, took one step forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. "Alden," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "You are not in charge of this room right now. And as I just told your daughter, this stopped being a private family dinner the moment it was paid for with stolen funds. I suggest you sit back down and listen to the auditor." My father looked as though he had been physically struck. No one ever spoke to him that way. He slowly sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a creeping, terrible dread. I turned my attention back to the table and held up the very first document. It was a single, crisp sheet of paper, heavily highlighted in yellow. "This," I announced, dropping it right next to Corinne's plate of half-eaten lobster, "is the official events invoice for tonight. Von Aero Services was just billed $24,000 for a supposedly essential corporate strategy meeting. According to this itemized receipt, the company paid for a premium seafood package for 30 people, an open bar featuring vintage wines, and a luxury executive hotel suite booked strictly under Corinne's name for the entire weekend." I paused, letting the massive number sink into the minds of the board members. Yet, I continued, pointing down at the empty white plate sitting in front of my son, when I checked the final seating chart. The prepaid steak medallion meant for the child who actually gave you a reason to celebrate tonight was manually removed. I looked directly at Jet, the terrified restaurant manager still standing near the wall. I asked him to explain to the board exactly who authorized that specific change. Jet swallowed hard, stepping slightly forward into the light. He looked at Corinne, then quickly looked away, terrified of her wrath but more terrified of the federal lawyer, watching his every move. Ms. Vaughn emailed the revision directly to me early this morning, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I kept the message because her instructions were highly unusual. She explicitly told me to retain the original charge on the corporate account, but to remove the child's meal entirely and use the surplus budget to send a second bottle of Bordeaux to her end of the table. Corinne's face darkened with a sudden, vicious rage. She pushed her chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice shrill and defensive. It was a joke. It was a harmless family joke to teach the boy some humility. "You are blowing this entirely out of proportion, Sutton." "A joke creates laughter, Corinne," I replied softly, staring dead into her panicked eyes. "This created a fraudulent invoice discrepancy. You used corporate funds to feed your ego, and you stole food from a child to do it." I picked up the next thick folder from my briefcase. The heavy brass clasp clicked open loudly. "But the $24,000 dinner is just pocket change," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "It is nothing compared to what I found hiding in the maintenance ledgers. I suggest you all put down your forks, because what I am about to show you is going to ruin a lot more than just your appetite." The tension in the private dining room was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. I pulled a series of large, high-resolution photographs from the second folder and began tossing them, one by one, down the length of the table. They slid across the pristine white linen, coming to a stop near my father's water glass and Corinne's trembling hands. Over the previous 18 months, I announced, maintaining a steady, unrelenting rhythm, Corinne has personally approved $1.2 million in fast-tracked payments to 3 specific subcontracting firms. These firms were supposedly providing critical, certified hydraulic parts for our commercial aviation clients. I pointed to the photographs scattered on the table. Each picture showed the exact same dilapidated, abandoned storefront sitting next to a dirty laundromat. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood. Trash littered the sidewalk. "Those 3 firms do not exist," I stated, the facts falling like hammer blows. "They have no employees. They have no manufacturing equipment. They do not possess a single active federal aviation license. They are ghost companies." And yet, Corinne signed off on their safety certifications using an old, unauthorized digital copy of my professional compliance signature. My mother, Blythe, let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. My father's complexion turned a sickly, pale gray. He looked down at the photos of the abandoned storefront, his eyes wide with horror. I was not finished. I pulled out a massive, detailed spreadsheet, laying it flat on the table. I followed the digital money trail. I continued, my voice gaining strength. The $1.2 million paid to these ghost companies was immediately routed through 2 offshore holding accounts. Within 48 hours of the final transfer, those exact funds were deposited into a private, blind trust. I dropped one final photograph onto the table. It was a beautiful, glossy picture of a massive luxury ski chalet in Aspen, surrounded by pristine snow and pine trees. "A trust that immediately purchased this property," I said, looking directly at Corinne. "The exact same property you have been bragging about on your social media accounts all winter. You used uncertified, dangerous, counterfeit parts on commercial airplanes, risking thousands of innocent lives, just so you could buy a vacation home." Corinne pushed her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, looking like a trapped animal. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is lying," Corinne screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany walls. "She fabricated all of this. You all know how jealous Sutton has always been of me. She hacked into my computer. She made these documents up because she could not handle being the family failure. My mother immediately rushed to Corinne's defense, acting on decades of blind instinct. She stood up, her face tight with anger. "Sutton, this is a sick, twisted thing to do," she yelled, pointing at me. "How could you orchestrate such a malicious lie just to ruin your sister's evening? We always knew you were bitter, but this is unforgivable." They were predictable. They were always so incredibly predictable. They would rather believe I was a criminal mastermind who forged thousands of pages of federal documents than admit their golden child was a fraud. But I did not have to defend myself, because the silence was broken by someone else. "Stop it, Mom." The voice came from the far end of the table. Declan, our younger brother, slowly stood up. He had spent the entire evening staring miserably at his shoes, but now his face was pale and drawn tight with a fury I had never seen in him before. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. "Declan," my father warned, his voice shaking. "Stay out of this." "No," Declan fired back, his voice cracking with emotion. "I will not stay out of it. Sutton is not lying." He threw his papers onto the table. They scattered over the photos of the Aspen chalet. When Sutton's audit team locked down the corporate servers last week, they found the archived emails from 3 years ago, Declan said, looking at our father with tears of rage in his eyes. "Do you remember the anonymous tip that claimed I was drinking on the job? The tip that cost me the lead supervisor role and nearly destroyed my entire career?" My father swallowed hard, refusing to look at him. The IT forensics proved that the email came directly from Corinne's private office computer, Declan shouted, his voice echoing in the silent room. "She routed it through a proxy server to hide her tracks, but she forgot to clear the internal cache. She framed me. She ruined my reputation just so she could take over my project budget and boost her own quarterly bonus." Corinne stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. The alliance she had relied on her entire life was fracturing into pieces right in front of her eyes. She had kept Declan and me isolated from each other for years, feeding us different lies so we would never compare our experiences. But the truth was out in the open now, and it was burning her empire to the ground. My mother looked at Corinne, her hands trembling. "Corinne?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Tell me he is lying. Tell me you did not do that to your own brother." Corinne looked away, her silence confirming everything. The room felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The family was tearing itself apart, the ugly reality finally laid bare. But the final, fatal blow was still waiting in my briefcase. Corinne recovered from the initial shock by doing the only thing she knew how to do when she was backed into a corner. She rewrote reality. She smoothed her expensive dress, let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, and crossed her arms over her chest. "Fine," she snapped, glaring at Declan and me with pure venom. "So what? Business is brutal. I did what I had to do to protect the Vaughn name and maximize our profits. You two are just soft." She turned her attention to the board members standing near the door, her confidence returning in a desperate, ugly wave. "You cannot do anything to me," she declared, waving her hand dismissively at the federal lawyer. "My father owns 60% of the voting shares in this company. He controls the board. He will never, ever let you fire me. I am the vice president. I am untouchable." She looked at my father, expecting him to immediately nod and command the board members to leave. "Dad, tell them," she demanded. My father opened his mouth to speak, to offer his golden child the protection she always demanded. But before he could utter a single syllable, I reached into the very bottom of my briefcase and pulled out one final, heavy document. It was bound in thick blue leather and sealed with a heavy gold notary stamp. "You do not understand how a family trust works, Corinne," I said, my voice cutting through her arrogant delusion. I opened the blue folder and placed it squarely in the center of the table. "Years ago," I explained, looking directly at my father, who was now staring at the blue folder with a look of dawning terror. "Dad transferred equal economic shares to all 3 of his children. But he retained all the voting authority through a massive family trust. You thought those votes would automatically become yours the second he retired." Corinne scoffed. "They will be." He promised me. What you do not know, I continued, my voice steady and unforgiving, is what happened 6 months ago when the federal insurance inquiry first began. Dad panicked. He knew if the company was found guilty of massive negligence, his personal assets could be seized. He needed a legal shield. I looked at Greer, the compliance lawyer. She nodded grimly. Because my professional license strictly requires me to remain entirely outside of Von Aero Services management, I was the only family member who qualified as an unbiased third party, I explained. So, to protect his own wealth, Dad secretly appointed me as the independent trust protector. Corinne's arrogant smirk faltered. What does that mean? She demanded, her voice losing its edge. It means, Greer spoke up, her voice ringing with authority, that your sister has the unique legal power to instantly freeze all voting transfers and suspend any executive officer if she uncovers credible, documented evidence of financial fraud that threatens the assets of the trust. I looked at Corinne. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. This afternoon, I said softly, while you were busy mocking my son for winning a national award, I officially exercised that legal right. I turned to the board members. Gentlemen, as the acting trust protector, I am presenting you with undeniable proof of federal fraud. I am officially suspending Corinne Vaughn from all executive duties, effective immediately. Charles, the senior board member, stepped forward. His face was grim. The board recognizes the suspension, he stated formally. Corinne, your executive authority is stripped. Your access to all company financial accounts has already been frozen. Your corporate email and building pass were deactivated 10 minutes ago. No, Corinne screamed, a guttural, desperate sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. You cannot do this. Dad, stop them. She lunged toward our father, grabbing his arm. But for the first time in 38 years, Alden Vaughn did not move to protect her. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at the photos of the fake warehouses, realizing that his blind favoritism had nearly destroyed his entire legacy. He pulled his arm away from her grasp. 2 large security guards in dark suits entered the dining room, stepping smoothly past Greer. They walked directly to Corinne. Ms. Vaughn, one of the guards said, his voice deep and polite, but leaving no room for argument. We need you to hand over your company phone and your access badge. Then we are going to escort you off the premises. Corinne looked around the room, her eyes wild, searching for a savior. She looked at our mother, who was sobbing silently into a napkin. She looked at Declan, who turned his back to her. Finally, she looked at me. The hatred in her eyes was toxic, but it held no power anymore. She was just a bully who had finally lost her weapon. She roughly threw her company phone onto the table, shattering the screen, and let the guards escort her toward the heavy mahogany doors. As she was led away, leaving her stolen diamonds and her half-eaten lobster behind, the room plunged into a profound, heavy silence. The golden child had fallen, and the earth had finally stopped spinning around her. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the security guards, sealing Corinne's fate. The silence left in her wake was thick, oppressive, and smelled faintly of melted butter and ozone. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed to remember how to breathe. Then, the agonizing sound of weeping broke the quiet. My mother, Blythe, slumped forward over her pristine white plate, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently. Sutton, how could you do this? She sobbed, her voice muffled and wet. Your own sister. You have ruined her life. You have ruined the family name. The press is going to find out. Everyone at the country club will know. Could you not have just hidden the report? We could have paid the money back quietly. We could have saved her face. I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with deep disgust. Even now, surrounded by irrefutable proof of massive fraud, betrayal, and federal crimes, her only concern was the family image. She was still trying to sweep $1 million of theft under the rug just to avoid an awkward conversation at her tennis matches. My father finally spoke. His voice was raspy, drained of its usual booming power. He looked at me, his eyes red and exhausted. "Did you really have to do this tonight, Sutton?" he asked, his tone laced with a pathetic, defeated sorrow. "Over a dinner reservation? Are you truly willing to send your sister to a federal prison just because she did not order a plate of food for your son?" The question hung in the air, heavy and absurd. I felt the cold, surgical ice in my chest harden into pure steel. I looked at the man who had demanded I sacrifice my entire life to appease his favorite child. "I am not sending her to prison over a plate of food, Dad," I said, my voice steady, ringing with an undeniable clarity that made him flinch. "I am Voktran her because she willfully used uncertified, dangerous parts on commercial airplanes. She traded the safety of thousands of innocent passengers for a ski chalet and a bottle of wine." I pointed a firm finger at the empty white plate sitting in front of Hayes. "The empty plate did not cause this audit," I continued, staring directly into my father's eyes. "The empty plate merely proved to me that she deserves absolutely no mercy. She took food from an 11-year-old boy because she thought she was a god who could punish anyone she deemed unworthy. She removed his meal because she could. She stole my signature because she could. She framed Declan because she could. And she did all of it because you spent 38 years teaching her that there were no consequences for her actions." My father closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his weathered cheek. He had spent his entire life claiming he needed a strong, ruthless leader for the company. Now he was staring at the horrifying wreckage of what unchecked ruthlessness actually looked like. I turned away from my parents. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to salvage here, no more illusions to maintain. I knelt down next to Hayes. My sweet, brilliant boy was sitting perfectly still, his wide eyes processing the massive earthquake that had just shattered our family. I reached out and gently cupped his cheek. "Come on, baby," I whispered, giving him a warm, genuine smile. "The air in here is getting a little stale. Let's go find something good to eat." Hayes nodded, a small, relieved smile breaking through his anxiety. He reached under his chair, retrieved his carefully folded National STEM Aviation Award certificate, and tucked it safely into his pocket. He grabbed my hand, his small fingers wrapping tightly around mine. I picked up my black briefcase, the brass locks clicking shut with a final, definitive snap. I did not say goodbye to my parents. I did not look at the board members. I simply turned my back on the wreckage of the Vaughn family dynasty and walked out of the private dining room, my son's hand securely in mine. We walked out into the cool, crisp night air of the city. The streetlights glowed warmly against the pavement. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with clean, unburdened air for the first time in 38 years. The empire was crumbling behind me, but as I looked down at my son, I knew the real work was only just beginning. Part 11, light after the storm. The fallout from that $24,000 dinner was swift, brutal, and entirely public. I did not have to leak a single document to the press. The sheer magnitude of the federal investigation did the work for me. Within 3 weeks, the Federal Aviation Administration formally stepped in, launching a massive joint task force with the Department of Justice. The ghost companies were raided, the offshore accounts were traced, and the counterfeit parts were systematically tracked down and removed from the commercial fleets before any catastrophic failures could occur. Corinne's arrogant delusion shattered against the harsh reality of the federal justice system. Because her employment contract contained a strict misconduct clause, she instantly lost her unvested executive equity and the massive severance package she had always counted on. The courts froze her assets, including the stolen Aspen Chalet, which was promptly seized and auctioned off to begin paying back the restitution. She faced multiple federal charges for wire fraud and falsifying safety records. The golden child, who had spent her entire life believing she was above the law, was suddenly looking at the very real prospect of spending a decade in a federal penitentiary. Her wealthy friends abandoned her, her social circles vanished, and her carefully curated image was burned to ashes in the morning papers. My parents struggled profoundly with the new reality. My mother called me incessantly during the first few months, leaving desperate, weeping voicemails, begging me to speak to the federal prosecutors. asking me to submit a letter claiming Corinne was under extreme emotional distress. She wanted me to fix the mess, just like I had always been expected to fix everything else. I never answered her calls. I forwarded the voicemails to a secure folder and maintained a wall of total silence. You cannot heal a burn by putting your hand back into the fire. My father was forced into an immediate, humiliating early retirement. The board of directors, desperate to save the company's contracts and public image, demanded he step down as CEO. The reality of his failure broke him far more than losing his title. He had to stand in front of his shareholders and admit that his blind nepotism had nearly destroyed the legacy he spent 40 years building. In a surprising turn of events, the board promoted Declan to interim director of field operations. Freed from Corinne's toxic sabotage, my younger brother flourished. He proved to be a thoughtful, meticulous leader. But when they offered him the permanent CEO position, he wisely declined. He told the board the company desperately needed an external leader with zero family ties to clean up the toxic culture. They hired a brilliant infrastructure executive named Marisol. She immediately created an anonymous reporting system, separated project approvals from payment authorizations, and ordered independent safety reviews across the board. Employees who had been unfairly punished or fired under Corinne's reign of terror were invited to submit their records. Several received formal apologies and significant compensation. Von Aero Services survived, but it was fundamentally, permanently changed. Through all the chaos, I focused entirely on Hayes. I made sure my son understood the profound difference between justice and cruelty. We never mocked Corinne's children, my niece and nephew. I made it explicitly clear to Hayes that his cousins were innocent bystanders in a war started by their mother, and that they deserved our compassion, not our ridicule. Revenge that targets innocent people merely recreates the original trauma, and I refused to pass that generational poison down to my son. My own independent compliance firm expanded rapidly. The industry recognized the auditor, who had the courage to take down her own corrupt family to protect the public. But more importantly, my home was peaceful. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that used to follow me like a dark shadow was gone. The storm had raged. It had torn the old structures down to their foundations, but the light that followed was brilliant and clear. Exactly 1 year after the disastrous dinner that changed our lives, Hayes and I walked through the grand glass doors of the State Aerospace Museum. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive skylights, illuminating the vintage airplanes suspended from the high ceilings. We were not there for an award ceremony this time. We were there for a ribbon cutting. The National STEM Foundation had been so impressed with Hayes's collision warning sensor that they had partnered with a local university to fully fund its development. They had built a brand new, state-of-the-art youth engineering laboratory inside the museum, and they had named the primary testing bay after my son. I stood in the back of the crowded room, watching proudly as Hayes, now 12 years old and standing a little taller, used a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors to cut the red ribbon. The crowd cheered, a genuine, warm sound that filled the massive space. Hayes smiled, his face radiant with pure, unburdened joy. He didn't look over his shoulder to see if anyone was mocking him. He didn't try to make himself smaller. He simply stood in his own light, exactly where he belonged. After the ceremony, we decided to skip the fancy catered reception and walked down to the small, bustling museum cafe on the ground floor. The menu was beautifully simple: grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup, and basic pastries. We stood in line, the smell of roasted coffee filling the air. Hayes looked up at the glowing menu board, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "What are you going to get, buddy?" I asked, bumping my shoulder gently against his. He grinned up at me. "I think I am going to get a hot dog, Mom, with extra ketchup." The words caught me off guard for a fraction of a second. A hot dog. For an entire year, I had viewed the concept of cheap food, the missing steak, the cruel exclusion, as the ultimate symbol of our family's humiliation. But looking at my son's bright, smiling face, I realized something profound. "Are you sure that choice doesn't bother you?" I asked softly, watching his eyes. Hayes shrugged his shoulders, a casual, easy movement. "It's just food, Mom," he said, echoing the words my mother had weaponized a year ago, but this time, they held a completely different meaning. The food was never the problem. Aunt Corinne was the problem. And she is not here anymore. His answers stopped me in my tracks. He was so incredibly wise. He refused to let Corinne own his memories. He refused to let her turn a simple meal into a permanent symbol of pain. We ordered our food, sat down at a small aluminum table near the window, and he ate every single bite of that hot dog with a look of pure contentment. That evening taught me the final, most important lesson of our entire story. Breaking a toxic family cycle is not just about winning the loudest argument or orchestrating the perfect revenge. It is about refusing to pass the injury forward to the next generation. It means protecting your children without teaching them hatred. It means demanding fierce accountability without becoming cruel yourself. And it means recognizing, deep in your bones, that keeping the peace by swallowing your own pain is not peace at all. It is just obedience. I once believed that strength meant enduring everything without complaint. I thought being the bigger person meant letting them shrink me until I disappeared. Now I know the truth. True strength can sound like one calm, steady word, noted, spoken at the exact moment you decide the pattern ends with you. My announcement in that restaurant did not destroy our family. It simply exposed the rot that had already been destroying us for decades. The truth cost us titles, money, relationships, and comfortable illusions. But it gave my son something infinitely more valuable, the undeniable proof that his dignity is not negotiable. And it gave me back the voice I had surrendered so many years ago. So, here is the question I still think about, the one I want to leave you with today. When keeping the family together requires sacrificing the most vulnerable person at the table, what exactly are we protecting? Sometimes, the bravest, most loving act is not forgiving immediately or forcing a toxic harmony. Sometimes, it is standing up, telling the brutal truth, and allowing the consequences to finally enter the room. What do you think? Did I go too far by letting the federal authorities dismantle my sister's life, or was it the only way to stop a monster? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. Remember, your boundaries are your armor. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next video.